Rendering a perspective sketch in Photoshop is very similar to rendering a floor plan in Photoshop. And basically, you're going to be adding in some materials, probably some shadows, maybe even some lighting, and some entourage, which is to say things like trees and cars and people. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. And I'm going to have you guys draw a section perspective. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But the biggest one is that it allows you to show both the interior and the exterior of your projects. And this is important for a number of reasons. One, I have interior and architectural students, so you each need a chance to show your stuff. The other thing is that the process is basically the same, just the materials are different, but everyone should experience both. And I've made a Pinterest page here with images that I have culled off the internet so you can see what some examples look like, and also to give proper credit to the people who created the images. And the big thing is that you'll see the interior looks fully developed with materials and scale figures, but the connection to the exterior is very clear, and the same approach is taken with exterior material. And these drawings can be hand-drawn, and the added background placed in here is done all in Photoshop. This is an image of the city. You can see that the image here is somewhat faded in the background, so it doesn't distract from the part that is the designed part. In this case, it's a project in a tower well above the cityscape. You'll also see in each of these that there's definitely a stylistic approach. Some people will use full-on photorealism or photographs of objects, but in this case you can see they've also faded them. They've added some kind of smudging on top of the drawing to give it a little bit more of a hand-drawn feel. And in fact, the drawing itself looks hand-drawn, so it probably had its own smudges which came right in, and that again lends to the stylistic character of the drawing. And that character does not have to be photorealistic. In this case, you can see they've added in a photorealistic tree, perhaps some people, but this is much more cartoonish and much more of an illustration, and that is actually perfectly okay. And it also gives us an opportunity to talk about the elements of these perspective drawings. Section perspectives. And the biggest thing is that it is a section perspective. So a section drawing has poche. And each of these drawings you'll see approaches poche in a different way, sometimes color, sometimes solid black, sometimes a little gray. It's a kind of stylistic concern, but the way to do it in terms of Photoshop skills is basically pretty similar to the way we did it in our floor plans. You'll also see there is an approach to what's underground. We are slicing through a building, and that includes the ground, and they kind of suggest some foundation walls here, but it's not fully structurally sound. It just is a suggestion. And then they've suggested dirt somehow. Typically these buildings are in dirt. Finally, there is a sky, and there is a horizon line typically. Sometimes it is just suggested, and sometimes it is drawn in a more full manner. And also you'll see that some buildings will sink pretty deep into the ground. Again, it depends on the size and scale of the building. And this particular drawing combines a sort of very sketchy approach to the ground, very stylized, with a more photorealistic approach for the site where the building occurs. And then the sky is also a realistic looking sky. There is some filtering going on to make the drawing look a little softer and draw your attention to the architecture that is being designed. As mentioned, it is perfectly fine to be more abstract in your materials. You can see how here they've kind of used very, watercolory, suggestive kind of colors here to represent different planes in the project, but it's absolutely not photorealistic. It's more of a sketchy kind of rendering. So let's open up this perspective drawing here. It's called Sandwich Shop Section Perspective. And as we did before in Photoshop, just remember, first of all, there are different kinds of bounding boxes here. In this case, the media box will be fine. You'll also see there is a resolution that should always be at 200 pixels per inch for what we do here in architecture land. And then it should be a color drawing. And just click OK to open up the file. As we did before, with our floor plan, we can go to our Layers menu, make ourselves a new layer. We can label these layers, for example, poche. And then you can use the paint bucket to add in your material. And if you remember our settings for the paint bucket, in addition to setting the color here in the foreground color, we have to tell it to paint the foreground color. 100% opaque is fine. Tolerance at the default value is fine. But you also want to check contiguous and all layers. And that way it recognizes the background layer. And you can just fill in your poche. In this case, we have added in this little footing here just to indicate what it looks like. Another technique that we used in the past is to create a clipping mask and just paint in a clipping mask area. I'm going to draw in the dirt here, but I just want it to go below the ground, so I can select that area in advance using any number of my selection tools, but the polygonal lasso is a classic. For doing that, select the area where you want the dirt to go. Make yourself a new layer and click on the mask button, and you'll see that it will mask away any materials that are in the painted black in the mask. Click back on the material and you should be able to come in with your paint bucket and paint the ground and have it only show up below. Now, you can also do other things to make the material a little more interesting. First of all, I'm noticing a little bit of fringing here. It's not quite getting the boundary that I want. It's not close enough. You can change the tolerance here to a higher or lower number. 32 is the default. But if I click with a higher number, you see it will actually fill everything up, but probably a happy medium is probably double the default. Let's try 64. You might have to click a couple of times, but you see how it fills in that little fringing, which was kind of annoying. And I absolutely could have used an image of dirt. One technique that you can use here that we used when we were looking at how to make your plans more sketchy is to draw with a brush on top of this color, and that might soften it just a little bit. Again, what brush you choose is kind of up to you, but I'm going to use this splattery kind of brush. I'm going to use the left and right brackets to adjust its size, and then I can kind of splatter a lighter color onto the ground. I can also click and drag to get a little more dramatic effect. And you can use different brushes in different combinations, get all sorts of different effects. And you can even use the eraser tool to erase the edge of the ground to get it to have that sort of faded off effect that we saw when we did our floor plans. And also, as we saw in our floor plans, layer order matters. When you drag the poche layer up and down, it will change the overlapping, which is what we want. And of course, we want the lines to be on top of everything else. When you move those lines up, you have to change the blending mode here, the layer blending mode, from normal to multiply. And what multiply will do is force the white to be invisible and the black to be opaque on this particular layer. Just like we did with the floor plan, painting in solid colors is super easy. And when you have a project with walls, walls are typically a solid color. So let's just make a new layer and paint in our walls a solid color. And I'm not going to go over each step of making a new layer, using the paint bucket, choosing a color, blah, 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 blah. I'll assume that you know how to do that. One thing you can do to give your solid and very flat looking color a little bit of depth is to add in a gradient onto this wall. And if you go and look at walls in the world, which there are many, you'll notice that most of them kind of get a little darker towards the edges. And this is actually, there's a computer world name for this. It's called ambient occlusion. But in hand drawing world or computer drawing world, we can just use a gradient in Photoshop. So I'll make myself a new layer for the gradient right above the walls layer. I'm also going to use the magic wand and select this back wall area. I should make sure, I'm going to sample all my layers here. There we go. And once I've got that area selected, I'm going to activate the gradient tool. It's hiding here under the paint bucket. So I'll just click and drag on the paint bucket to call up the gradient. And there are any number of different kinds of gradients out there. First of all, the simplest one, the default one, is it just goes from the foreground color to the background color. But I just want a little black here. So I'm going to go to the down arrow here next to the gradient icon. And there's a whole bunch of different ones in here as you scroll through. Clouds, all sorts of different things, neutrals. Let's just go with a black to white gradient. And if you leave your mouse over it, it will tell you what it is. And then it's just a matter of clicking and dragging in your view. I'm going to hold down Shift so that the gradient aligns with the wall. And you can see that it makes it nice and dark. But I think that's a little too dark for my tastes. I'm going to hit Undo, Control Z. And I'm going to start the gradient a little above the wall. And then I'm going to, again, hold down Shift, and I'm going to stop it just a little above the wall. See how that gives me just a little bit of darkness on my view. And I can do the same on the bottom if I wanted. I think I'll stick it with it on the top. Finally, I can make this layer blending mode multiply. And you can see here, I'll tap Control D to deselect. Gives me just a little bit of depth, and if you don't like how strong it is, you can tone it down just a little bit. But you see how that gives you just a little sense of three-dimensional depth in the wall. And maybe I'll add in some on the side wall, and even some here down at the bottom. And by the way, I think I'll add this in by going and making a new layer and reselecting that area I selected. Sometimes you spend a lot of effort getting a selection area. You can recall that selection just by choose the reselect button, and I'll draw in my little gradient down here on the ground, and finally make this one multiply also. And you see how that each of those gives you just a little bit of sense of depth. Finally, I can combine these either by making a group if I think I'm going to come back and do it again later. In this case, I think I'm just going to merge them onto one layer, and that is a lot simpler. And I'll repeat the process for the side wall. The trick with the side wall is to get the gradient to angle appropriately based on where the wall is. You see how I'm getting kind of a wedge shape here. I want to go as perpendicular to this wall as possible. And you should continue painting other solid items. I have a kind of menu board up here, maybe another menu board, even doors. Those and the sides of the cabinets, those can be solid colors. And if you prefer, you can add on a little gradient to give them a little bit of depth. One technique that works pretty well is to paint in the glass for the windows here on the back of the wall, but then draw in with a brush tool, maybe set at around 50%, draw in some kind of highlights on the glass. And this kind of just gives you the sense that it's a bright area or that it has a reflection. And another trick while we're back in this area, I'm going to deselect that, make myself a new layer, drag it below, and I'm going to make a layer for the trim. And there's always trim around doors. And then you can just use the layer ordering here to make the trim appear to be behind the glass. I'm just going to use a polygonal lasso to select the door frame. Again, you don't always have to be completely precise. And now when I paint in the area, it should give me a background color. The trick here is I'm not going to sample all layers, but I'll leave it at contiguous. And like magic, it paints the wall frame, or the frame on the wall quite nicely, but the glass sits in front because of the layer orders. Drawing in the flooring down here is a little more tricky. If you remember from our floor plan, this is wood. Now, the way we're going to do that is zoom way out and paint a big rectangle filled with that wood flooring. So here I've made myself a new layer. I've selected an area using the marquee selection tool, big rectangle. I'm going to go to my paint bucket and I'll tell it to paint the pattern, and hopefully it still remembers the flooring pattern that I used before. There it is, very nice. And the other thing that I'll want to do is deselect all layers. I want it to just fill this rectangle with wood. And you can see here that it did. When you click on the Move tool with this selected, you should see these transformation controls. These are little grips that you can click and drag on. You can also hold down Shift to kind of warp the layer. If you're not seeing those transformation tools, make sure that this button is checked. So what I want to do is try and warp this so that it fits in perspective into my drawing. Now, first of all, let's drag it down below the other layers so that it shows up properly. So now we're really seeing it well underneath the plan. The trick is I want to warp these so that each of these endpoints can adjust itself with the perspective distortion. And to do that, we need to go to the Edit pull-down menu, and there are special transformation tools here, quite a few different ones, but Distort is going to be the one that will get us the manipulation we want. I'll choose that. When I do that, now look what I can do. I can grab these endpoints, and if I remember correctly, my flooring goes kind of horizontally in this project. And as you drag these endpoints over to the four corners of your room, and remember our perspective is cutting, it's a section perspective, so we are seeing a rectangular area of flooring. Now I can warp this guy into position, and just like magic, I'll click the Commit Transformation button here at the upper right. I'll just click off of the object. You can see that actually looks like it's in perspective. Again, using the perspective lines in your plan, we know this wall is a rectangle, but any object that goes on that wall that is rectangular, because of perspective, we have to warp it to match the distortion that we see. So here's our floor, and the only thing we need to do is crop away the edges of the countertop. Now to do that, I'm going to just use a mask. I'm going to go to the floor plan, use my magic wand tool, and in this case I'm not going to sample all layers because I don't want it to see all the other layers. I just want it to see the floor plan layer, which, if you remember, is the layer with the lines. I'll click in the middle of the floor, and that should select the perimeter of where this wood flooring goes. Now I've got my tolerance set to 32. If you are using a hand-drawn drawing, you may need to use these multiple selection tools here, lassos, polygonal lassos. Each of these, by the way, you can add or subtract to the selection area by either holding down Alt to remove or Shift to add to the selection area. Now I'm going to go back to my original selection, go back down to the layer for wood flooring, and with this area selected, I just need to click the Mask tool, and like magic, it creates this little layer mask here. You can kind of see that the little white area in the mask is the area I had selected, and that will crop your flooring to the view. And just like we did with the painting the walls, you can paint all the other objects in the space either with a material or with a solid color. And like I did with the walls, I added in a little tiny layer here of gradient just to give it a little bit of a sense of depth. This same warping technique can be used for things like a menu. I imported this one from the internet, just copied and pasted it in, and we can use our transformation tools to distort it to match the perspective. Again, you just want to figure out where the perspective lines are supposed to go, and then drag the edges of your image into the correct position. And again, as mentioned previously, I have my layer for my floor plan up above all these other layers, and that really helps to help you see where your object needs to go. Painting exterior materials is really no different than what we did before, doing selection areas in your project to get, say, grass in there, and then either painting in a rectangular area or creating an adjustment layer with a pattern. Now, I'm going to use an adjustment layer for the grass because guess what? There is grass here in Photoshop. And you can choose, obviously, winter or spring, but the scale is way off, right? We really want to be careful and make sure that the scale looks appropriate to your project. And then you can come in and use things like gradients to kind of soften the grass somewhat. And of course, don't forget to use your drawing order so that it shows up correctly. In this case, I think I'll add a layer for a gradient here. Click my gradient tool, and like I did before, click and drag down to see if I can get a nice soft area here over the edge, maybe a little bit more. Exterior materials do need a little bit of help to look like they're receding toward the horizon. Finally, that obviously doesn't work so great because I'm covering up the whole sky. So I'll want to reselect my selection area for the grass, and I can apply a mask using that pre-selected area, and it'll crop it right down. And like we did before, go to multiply, decide how much of an effect we want by changing the opacity. I think it actually looks better with a little bit more. And then I'm going to merge these two layers. Again, you don't have to merge the layers, but I find it's helpful for me to keep track of everything. And often the area kind of away from your project can be a light gray area or light green or even light brown. You're basically just trying to represent the space off heading near the horizon, which is typically kind of blurry and out of focus anyway. Creating the sky, you have a couple of choices. You could absolutely just go get a picture of a sky, and especially if it works with your project, by all means, just be aware that your project is probably pretty high resolution, so you're going to need a pretty high resolution image. When you search, and I'm in Microsoft Bing here, but you can use any one you want, there's usually a filter option. You click that filter option and you can choose the size. I could type in an exact width, or I could just choose extra large, and most of these will be just fine. And I'm going to pick this one here. It does say it's public domain. And when you click through in Bing, keep clicking through till you'll get to the original image, the full-size image. And usually what you'll see is a little zoom icon here, which means when you zoom in it, you'll see how sharp that image actually is. And you can save it onto your computer, or you can really just copy it and paste it into Photoshop. And here it is in Photoshop. I can use my transformation controls to adjust it to fit into my image. If the image came in and it was smaller than your background image, you should probably find a bigger image in terms of pixel size. I can also use my transformation tools. The most basic one is just hold down Shift, and you can try to get kind of a sense of the sky, I don't know, heading off into the distance. And once you've warped the sky as you see fit, you can come in here and make a mask of what you want to not get cropped away. I'm going to use a polygonal lasso and just select the area here. Of course, I can use the layers that are behind my plan here, or my drawing, to help mask as well. Just click and drag here, complete your mask. Once you have the area selected on your sky layer, you should be able to just click the Add a Layer Mask button. And like magic, everything that was not selected disappears. So we are going to put on some finishing touches to our drawing. The first thing we should add is, or are, some trees. And I'm going to just go to the internet and find some images of trees. And as I mentioned, I do happen to like Bing, but any software, any search engine will do. The advantage of Bing, first of all, you can filter the way we did before. And the search criteria, I'm going to add transparent background. There's a few of these little keywords that help you to find materials and objects to put into your drawings. But transparent background is a nice one. It saves you a little bit of time. I'm going to filter for a large image. And let's see, I like this tree here. You'll probably want to choose a tree that has the kind of coloration and lighting that goes with the aesthetics of your drawing. And I'll click through. Again, as we saw previously, this is not the full-size image. You have to click one more time to open it up. And here's my image. A quirk of the universe is that in Windows, transparent backgrounds appear as black, whereas in the Mac world, they appear as white. But either way, you can copy the image. I'm going to save it onto the desktop here. And the reason is because I know that if I just copied and pasted it right into my Photoshop document, it actually would show black, or sometimes it shows black. So I'm going to save it onto my desktop. So when I've saved it, I can just go to my Photoshop document and choose Place Embedded. And what that will do, browse for my tree and double click on it to select it, is it brings the tree into my drawing. And now I am so happy that I have my tree. And again, we've done this in our floor plan. We can change the size of the tree using these transformation handles. Okay. I can copy the tree by holding down Alt and clicking and dragging. Let me just place it about there. Click Commit Transformation. And now with my Move tool, if I hold down Alt, I can make a couple of copies. Okay, and you can space them irregularly if you want. By the way, with your Move command, you can choose to have Auto Select on. What that will do is when you click on an object, it will automatically select it, and it will also automatically select that layer. Now, if I turn that off, no matter what I do, I can't select those other objects. And sometimes that is nice because it's very easy to incorrectly select an object. But either way, you can still make copies of the tree. Of course, you want to make sure, as we did in the plan, that it looks correct and that it does not overlap with the building itself. And finally, you can erase parts of it to make it blend in with the rest of your drawing, just like we did with our floor plan. Now, one of the things when you have entourage in your project that is annoying is that they often look kind of cut and pasty. And one quick way to make them seem not cut and pasty is to put in some shadows. And it's really pretty easy. We've got similar tools that we've used before. I'm going to use a brush tool. I'm going to make myself a new layer, and I'll call it shadows. And again, click the new layer button. And I dragged that layer here below my other trees so that it shows up underneath them. And you can also change the opacity of how dark it is. But I'm just going to draw in some shadows. Now, one architectural kind of, I don't know, graphic standard is that the sun often comes from the upper left of your drawing. So I'll just come in and I can click and drag to draw. I can also just click and make it a little bit darker. And there you go. You have a little bit of shadow under the trees. Now, adding in people is really no different than adding in trees, except that you now have to deal with the size of the people. I got a person with a transparent background from the internet, like I did before, saved it onto my computer, and placed it into Photoshop as an embedded image. To figure out how big this image should be to look correct in your space, well, of course, you could just resize it until it seems about right. My rule of thumb is to use the horizon line, which is out here in the side of my image, and try to put typically their eyes or the top of their head right around where the horizon line is. I'll drag them over. And then the correct size is where you want their feet to stand. So if I want this guy to be back by the door, I just put his feet there. As long as his head's in the correct position, it should look correct. Now, if I want him to, say, be in the front of the space, I just have to do the same thing. Get his head in the correct position and move his feet to where I want him to stand. And sometimes you'll see that people will put scale figures way in the foreground or way in the background, but it's always good to have a couple of scale figures to help you to understand how your project works. Now I could absolutely draw in on the ground some shadow, which I did here to kind of make it look like I did with the trees. But because people are special, we know people are special, and also humans are very attuned to what people look like in their images. I think I'm going to show you a special trick to do with this person. First of all, I'm going to select the person using the Move tool, and I can grab the layer also just by clicking on it. And I'm going to make a copy by holding down the Alt button. We've done this before. If you see your cursor become kind of the connection, the copy option. But I'm going to use this guy to make a reflection or a shadow on the floor. If I click and drag on this grip, but hold down Shift, you see how it can warp it in the opposite direction. So I can make a copy of this guy, and I can even use some of my transformation tools. Edit, Transform, Distort is probably a good one. And I can make it seem as if he's kind of reflecting on the ground. Of course, the ground looks pretty reflective the way I have it right now, but we can fix that. You can't get it exactly perfect, but you can see how he starts to look like a reflection. And I'll click Commit Transformation. I'll drag it below the layer that has the guy on it so that it seems to be underneath him. Now, to make your basic kind of reflection, that's it. I can lower the opacity here of the layer so that it seems to kind of blend into the floor a little bit. However, one other touch you can add is to add what's called a filter. And we've used a couple filters in before, but one that works really well is a blur. I'm going to go to the filter pull-down menu, blur, and then Gaussian blur. And Gaussian blur is nice because it gives you a little preview menu here. And of course, I can zoom in and out if I could find the image, but that's fine. We can just look at it on the floor and see how blurry we want it. Now, this corresponds directly with how much you think the floor is glossy versus matte. No blur means it's a glossy floor. But as we add in a little blur, perhaps that's more of a matte kind of finish or a satin. And I'll click OK, and there you go. You have yourself a very nice little kind of blurry reflection. In fact, I can even add a mask onto the blur, and if I click and drag from the bottom to the top, it adds a gradient. I added a gradient to the background here to the mask, and it will kind of get rid of part of it or fade it away, which again is kind of a realistic effect. And I'll turn back on my shadow that I had to kind of fill out the pieces that didn't quite come out. Now, if you really want to gild the lily, you just can't go far enough. You can apply to this shadow, click on the shadow, and there's one other thing we can do. We can apply a layer style to this layer. And I'll just click on down on the layer menu. I'll click on the FX button. That stands for effects. Click on that. And there is the drop shadow that I believe we used in floor plan that we used before. We are going to use a different one now. It's called color overlay. And what color overlay does is it basically replaces whatever's on that layer, whatever pixels are on that layer, with a color you specify. Now in this case I've specified black. I could make it red if I wanted, although that's a pretty funky looking shadow. Let's go back to black. That's better. Anyway, and then you can control how much of it is replaced by this black color. So I could even have a shadow that mixes with the reflection. And again, this is just a touch of additional realism to your project. Now I want to make a copy of this guy, put him outside as well. And you can do that with your trees and all this. Probably a good time now to get a little more organized. For example, all of these layers have to do with the trees. I'm going to select them by clicking on one and then holding down Shift and clicking on the other one to get a kind of batch of them. And I'll make a folder for it. And you don't have to do this, but once you start getting a lot of layers in your project, it actually is kind of a nice idea. Each of these layers, as you come upon them, you might want to make one for the interiors, or in this case, I'm going to make the guy and his reflection and the extra little bit of shadow. I can make that into a group as well. And this just makes it easy to copy them. I can just duplicate the group and call it person copy, and then take the person copy and move it somewhere else. Oh, except I missed the other objects there. I guess I better select them all and now move them. There we go. Other sorts of entourage that you can add, well, you don't have to use photorealistic people. I also searched for the silhouette of a bird, and that actually looks pretty good too. You can put that up in the sky, give you a little interest. My clouds are kind of boring in this particular project. So as you look at your drawing, another little flourish you can add is to add a little texture onto your drawing. And for instance, this poche just doesn't look all that great to me. I'd like to add a little bit of texture onto it, a little bit of graphical depth. So I went and found a seamless pattern of dirt. Yes, that's right, dirt. I'm going to create a new pattern adjustment layer. And let's go find my dirt. Here it is, my beautiful dirt. And you can change the scale of it. So I don't know, let's go with about 20. I really just want a little bit of kind of texture. And then I'll make the blending mode. This was a black and white dirt pattern. Make the blending mode multiply, and suddenly my poche becomes a lot more interesting. And again, I can drop the opacity like I've done before to get a little bit of blending, but it does kind of make the drawing, I don't know, a little more vibrant. And you can add that same dirt over, say, the ground and use blending modes and even gradient-based masks to create an interesting effect underground. One last fun thing you can do to add some interest to your drawing is to fake in some lighting. Now, lighting makes a huge difference in terms of your perception of the space, in this case the interior of the restaurant, but it also adds some interest and some creative kind of spark. So make yourself a new layer here. I'll just click new layer. Whoops, I'll click new layer. And of course you can label it lighting. And what you can do, first of all, you need somewhere for the light to come out of. I'm going to draw up on the ceiling. I'm going to draw a pair of ovals. And they're going to follow this course of ceiling tile that I have created. Just if you don't follow the course of that ceiling tile, they'll look a little funny. Everything should be typically in an alignment with each other. And I'm going to fill those with a little bit of white paint here. Click OK. Use my paint bucket to fill them with white. And remember, when you paint, it's the point of the arrow where the paint goes. So it's sometimes easy to forget that. But then I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to draw in some lighting kind of cones, almost as if the light itself was kind of coming out. Now, normally you don't really see the color, the light coming out of a fixture like this, unless it's really dusty. So I'm just going to draw kind of a big blobby area here. And I'm going to feather this selection here by just right-clicking on it and choosing feather. Don't have to feather it too much. 10 pixels is probably plenty. And I'm going to paint white into this area as well. Again, use my paint bucket, fill it with white. And you see how that kind of looks? It kind of looks like light is coming out. The trick here is you can probably use either a blending mode or just change the way that the layer, the opacity of the layer. Let's see, soft light is a good one, hard light is a good one. Maybe I'll just go with normal, but I'll change the opacity of the layer. And then, like we did with the shadow, I can add a mask onto this layer by just selecting the layer and click the mask tool and draw a gradient. And that gradient should make it appear as if the light is kind of fading off. And that's not quite as much of a fade as I want. There we go. Now that looks more like light is coming out of those light fixtures. And there you have it, a drawing in perspective that has all sorts of interesting features to it and looks pretty nice and seems somewhat realistic. So to sum up the assignment, your goal is not to replicate what I just did, but to take each of these techniques and apply them in your own drawing using your own materials and your own scale figures, your own sky, your own ground, and come up with an original composition. Now, to finish up in Photoshop, to prepare yourself for the requirements of our final board, I'd also like you to export a couple of images of your plan, of your drawing, with just the different elements visible in it. So export a version where you just see the birds, just see the people, just see the trees, just see the section cut, and that includes the line work underneath. Just the interior finishes would be good. And of course, now you can see I didn't finish my interior finishes. And then probably one for the sky and the ground. And you'll compose those on your final board in addition to a nice high, large-scale image of your perspective. Also, you're going to need to include sample images of any of those textures that you used to create the custom patterns in Photoshop. I have the dirt, and here's the one I used for the ceiling. And you're going to include those samples as well, even if it's just a solid color. For example, I used a solid color for the wall. You should include a swatch of that on your board. And you can just draw a new rectangle and sample the color here and pull it right over paint. You can use the eyedropper tool to sample the color, and then it'll paint right onto a new rectangle, which you can then put into Adobe InDesign. And that's all you need to prepare for putting together your final presentation.